Section 31 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 8, Part 3. The grand pageant of the welcome was a temporary bridge over the base court, reaching to the main building, 20 feet wide and 70 long. 7 pair of pillars were on this bridge, with mythological deities standing by them, offering to the queen symbolical gifts, as she rode between them. Thus on the tops of the first pair were large cages, containing live bitterns, curlews, hernshaws, godwits, and such dainty birds, offered to her by Silvanus, god of wood fowl. The next pair of pillars supported 2 great silver bowls, piled with apples, pears, cherries, filberts, walnuts, all fresh on their branches, the gifts of Pomona. Wheat in ears, oats and barley waved in the next bowls. The next pillar bore a silver bowl filled with red and white grapes, and opposite were 2 great livery pots of white silver, filled with claret and white wine, on which many of the queen's train, fatigued with the recent hunting party, in one of the hottest July evenings that ever occurred in England, were observed to cast longing eyes. The next pair of pillars supported silver trays, filled with fresh grass, on which laid the fish of the sea and rivers, with a river god standing by. The next pillars supported the trophies of arms and arts, music and physic, while a poet, in a cerulean garment, stood forth and explained the whole to her learned majesty, in a string of Latin hexameters, which we have no intention of inflicting on our readers. So passing to the inner court, her majesty, that never rides but alone, there alighted from her palfrey, and was conveyed up to her chamber. At this instant all the clocks in the castle were stopped, and, by a delicate attention, the hands continued to point at the moment of her arrival, since no one was to take note of the time during the royal sojourn at Kenilworth. When her majesty entered her chamber, peals of great guns were shot off, with a profusion of fireworks, which continued for 2 hours. The noise and flame, says Laneham, were heard and seen for 20 miles round about. This was on the Saturday night, and it may be surmised that many an aching head must have longed for the repose of the Sabbath after such a lullaby to their repose. But small repose did the sacred day bring. It is true, the queen and her court went to church in the morning, but in the afternoon was music and dancing of the lords and ladies with lively agility, and the Sabbath evening concluded with roaring discharges of fireworks and cannon, and though this time the fireworks did not set a town on fire, yet, says Laneham, they made me vengeably afraid. Monday was so hot that her majesty kept within till 5 in the evening, what time it pleased her to ride forth to hunt the hart of Forcey. On her homeward way a masking pageant met her in the chase. A salvage man, wreathed and girdled with oak leaves, having a young sapling oak plucked up, by way of a walking staff, and who represented the god Silvanus, intercepted her majesty's steed. He began to give utterances to a speech so long-winded and tedious, that when he had arrived at the first quarto page, her majesty put on her steed, but Silvanus, who, savage as he might be deemed, seems to have made no slight advance in the modern art of boring, began to run by her side, reciting the rest of his speech with wonderful volubility. At last, out of pity, the queen checked her horse to favour Silvanus, who humbly besought her majesty to go on, for if his rude speech did not offend her, he could continue to run and speak it for 20 miles, protesting he had rather run as her majesty's footman on earth than be a god on horseback in heaven. At these words her majesty came by a close arbour, made all of holly, and while Silvanus pointed to the same, the principal bush shaked, for therein were placed both sweet music, and one appointed to represent deep desire, who herewith stepped out of the holly bush, and recited a long speech to the queen, tediously stuffed with flattery. Then a concert of music sounded from the holly bower, while Deep Desire sang a dismal ditty, full of such tropes as cramps of care and gripes of grief. Therefore its quotation may be very well spared here. Sylvanus concluded the masque by breaking the oak sapling he used for a staff asunder, and casting it up in the air, but unfortunately one end almost fell on the head of the queen's horse, which started violently, and Sylvanus, who was no other than the poet Gascoigne, was terribly alarmed at the consequences of his awkwardness. "No hurt, no hurt," exclaimed the queen, as she skilfully controlled her horse. "And this benignity of the sovereign," continues Laneham, "we took to be the best part of the play, and assuredly Elisabeth showed both good nature and magnanimity in her reception of this accident." Towards night on Tuesday the queen chose to walk on foot over the bridge into the chase. At her return she stood on the bridge and listened to a delectable concert of music from a barge in the Pool. The queen hunted the hart of Forcey on Wednesday in the chase. The hart took to the Pool, where he was caught alive, and her majesty granted him his life on condition that he lost his ears for a ransom. This useless cruelty aptly preceded the bear baiting of the next day, when the virgin queen had the satisfaction of seeing a great sort of banddogs, which had been tied in the outer court, let loose on 13 bears, which were baited in the inner, where, says Laneham, there was plucking and tugging, scratching and biting, and such an expense of blood and leather between them as a month's licking, I ween, will not recover. This refined diversion took place in the daytime, but the Thursday evening concluded with strange and sundry kind of fireworks, and discharge of great guns for 2 hours, and during this din her majesty was entertained by an Italian tumbler of such extraordinary agility in twistings and turnings, that the court considered him to be more of a sprite than a man, and that his backbone must have been like a lamprey, or made of lute string. The drought and heat of the season was on the 2 succeeding days seasonably refreshed by rain and moisture. The queen, therefore, attended none of the shows in the open air. Until that time the weather had been hot and blazing. The second Sunday of Elizabeth's sojourn at Kenilworth was St. Kenelm's Day, the royal Saxon saint, who was murdered at the foot of the neighbouring Clent Hills, and whose patronage and influence was once supposed to extend far and wide over the Midland counties, especially round Kenilworth, his former palace. The new ritual had not yet superseded the ancient regard of Warwickshire for St. Kenelm, and the whole district was astir to do uproarious honour, at once to him and his successor, Queen Elizabeth. The weather again set in gloriously bright, and every one attended her majesty to church, where they heard a fruitful sermon. In the afternoon a comely quintain was set up, and a solemn bridal of a proper couple was marshalled in procession in the tilt-yard. The bride was 35, very ugly, red-haired, foul, ill-favoured, of complexion a brown bay. This amiable object was very anxious to be married, because she had heard she should be called on to dance before the queen. She was, however, wholly disappointed, for her majesty, who particularly disliked ugly persons, bestowed all her attention on the Coventry play of the slaughter of the Danes at Hocktide, wont to be played in that city yearly without ill example of papistry or any superstition. A sport representing a massacre was so wonderfully to the taste of the era, that the queen requested its repetition at the earliest opportunity, and to the infinite satisfaction of the men of Coventry, she gave them the royal benefaction of 2 bucks and 5 marks. Captain Cox made his entry at the Coventry play on his hobby horse, but it is a point in doubt whether he was a character in the play or a worthy flourishing at that time in Coventry. An ambrosial banquet and a gorgeous masque concluded those Sunday diversions. The heat of the next day caused the queen to keep within the castle till 5 in the afternoon, when she hunted the hart in the chase, and on her return beheld on the Pool before the bridge one of those grand water pageants which the marriage of Henry III had rendered fashionable in Europe. There was the Lady of the Lake on her illuminated island, attended by a swimming mermaid 24 feet in length, besides Arion on a dolphin of equal vastness. When it came to Arion's turn to make a speech to the queen, he, who had been rather too powerfully refreshed from the Earl of Leicester's cellar in order to qualify his aquatic undertaking, forgot his part, and pulling off his mask, swore, "He was none of Arion, not he, but honest Harry Goldingham," a proceeding which pleased the queen more than all the rest of the performance. Harry Goldingham had a fine voice, and was a poet who had aided in composing some of the interludes. He sang very well from the back of his dolphin, and concluded the pageant, to the universal satisfaction of the beholders. Such was the general tone of the princely pleasures of Kenilworth during the queen's visit, which lasted till July 27th. Laneham declares, moreover, that her majesty with her accustomed charity and mercy cured 9 persons of the painful disease, called the king's evil, which the kings and queens of this realm without other medicine, but only by touching and prayers, do cure. Among the dull metrical compliments offered in fatiguing profusion to Elizabeth at Kenilworth, there was one sufficiently absurd to be amusing, especially as it contained an historical allusion to the queen's rejection of Leicester's addresses. It is part of a lengthy dialogue, in which a salvage man, clad in ivy, questions Echo on the cause of the unusual splendours then enlivening the chase and domains of Kenilworth. The English language between the two was much tortured by various quaint quips and quirks, as for instance, the salvage man demanded, "And who gave all these gifts? I pray thee, Echo, say, was it not he who, but of late, this building here did lay?" Echo, Dudley. Salvage man, "Oh, Dudley, so methought, he gave himself and all, a worthy gift to be received, and so I trust it shall." Echo, "It shall." Salvage man, "What meant the fiery flames that through the waters flew? Can no cold answers quench desire? Is that experience true?" Elizabeth's attention was soon after recalled from the idle joyaunce of progresses and pageants by the important appeals that were made to her by the oppressed Protestants in the Low Countries. St. Aldegonda, the friend and confidant of the Prince of Orange, with other deputies, came over to England to implore her to accept the sovereignty of their states, as the descendant and representative of their ancient counts, through her illustrious ancestress, Philippa of Hainault. This ambassade, and its result, is chiefly summed up in 2 lines by Collins, in his Ode to Liberty: "Those whom the rod of Alva bruised, whose crown a British queen refused." Elizabeth was not prepared to contest this mighty adjunct to the Spanish Empire with Philip, and she replied evasively, offered publicly to mediate between him and the states, and privately encouraged the deputies to continue their resistance. They proposed to throw themselves on the protection of France, but from this step she earnestly dissuaded them, and privately supplied them with pecuniary aid. She also, by her intrigues with the Duke of Alençon, incited him to coalesce with the King of Navarre and the Huguenot party in France, thus furnishing Henry III with sufficient employment at home to prevent him from interfering in the affairs of the states. The details of these struggles belong to general history. On the 7th of January, Queen Elizabeth finally concluded an alliance, offensive and defensive, with the states, engaging to assist them with a loan of £100,000, with 5,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 horse. She soon after employed Casimir, the brother of the Elector Palatine, who proceeded as her lieutenant, with 12,000 German auxiliaries, to the Low Countries at the expense of England. The German mercenaries committed so many excesses that the poor Dutchmen found their friends even more intolerable than their foes, and requested to be placed under the protection of the Queen of England's suitor, Francis of Alençon, who had now assumed the title of Duke of Anjou, formerly borne by his brother Henry III. Elizabeth first regarded this requisition with jealous suspicion as a manoeuvre of the King of France, but there was no love between the brethren, and Anjou professed himself devoted to her interests. He was, indeed, a convenient tool, ready to be employed in any service, whereby his own personal advancement might be forwarded. This summer he sent an envoy of the name of Boucherville to prosecute his suit, who was accompanied by Rambouillet, sent from the king, his brother, to second his solicitations. The French envoys found Elizabeth at Long Melford Hall in Suffolk, the seat of Sir William Cordell, her master of the rolls, being the first in that county who had the honour of feasting the royal traveller, and who, to use the quaint language of Old Churchyard, the contemporary historian of the Eastern progresses, did light such a candle to the rest of the shire, that many were glad bountifully and frankly to follow the same example, with such charges as the whole train were in some sort pleased thereat. The next morning she rode from Melford to Lawshall Hall, where she dined with Sir William Drury. The royal visit is recorded in the parish register, as occurring August 5th, in the 20th year of her majesty's reign, to the great rejoicing of the parish, and all the country thereabouts. Elizabeth appears to have been on very affectionate terms with Lady Drury, for, on the death of Sir William Drury, who was slain 10 years later in France, she addressed to her the following friendly letter of condolence, or rather we may say, a kind of expostulation, on the excess of grief to which the widow had abandoned herself. Be well ware, my Bess, you strive not with divine ordinance, nor grudge at irremediable harms, lest you offend the highest Lord, and no whit amend your marred hap. Heap not your harms where help there is none, since you may not that you would wish, that you can enjoy with comfort a king for his power, and a queen for her love, who leaves not now to protect you when your case requires care, and minds not to omit whatever may be best for you and yours. Your most loving careful sovereign. Of a similar character to this quaint consolation is the brief and pithy letter of condolence, if such it may be called, addressed by Elizabeth to her friend Lady Paget, on the death of her daughter Lady Crumpton, which, in the brief space of a few lines, exhibits much good and honest feeling. No one could come more tersely to the point than Elizabeth, when she wrote under the strong impulse of anger or affection. What can be more simply sweet and gracious than the following specimen of familiar language from the generally Latinized pen of this learned queen: Call to your mind, good Kate, how hardly we princes can brook the crossing of our commands. How ireful will the highest power be, may you be sure, when murmurs shall be made of his pleasing his will. Let nature, therefore, not hurt herself, but give place to the giver. Though this lesson be from a silly vicar, yet it is sent from a loving sovereign. But to return to Elizabeth's eastern progress. Her majesty was astonished at the gallant appearance and brave array of the comely Suffolk squires, who came to meet and welcome her into their county. The bachelors, all gaily clad in white velvet, to the number of 200, and those of graver years, in black velvet coats and fair chains, with 1500 serving men, all mounted on horseback. These formed a volunteer guard of honour, under the command of the High Sheriff, Sir William le Spring, of Lavenham, and attended her majesty in her progress to the very confines of their county. A comely troop, says Churchyard, and a noble sight to behold. From Lawshall Hall, in the evening, the queen came to Hawstead Hall, at present the seat of Sir Thomas Cullum, where there are several memorials and traditions of her visit, where it is said that she dropped a silver-handled fan into the moat. The fans used by Elizabeth were made of feathers, set in a rich handle, and in form resembling a modern hand screen. The following is the description of one of those graceful accessories of the royal toilet, which was presented to her majesty by Sir Francis Drake as a New Year's gift. A fan of feathers, white and red, enamelled with a half moon of mother of pearls, within that a half moon garnished with sparks of diamonds, and a few seed pearls on the one side, having her majesty's picture in it, and on the reverse a device with a crow over it. Her majesty spent 10 days at various seats in Suffolk, and having been received on the borders of Norfolk by the cavaliers of the county, approached Norwich, as near as Brakenash, on the 16th of August. At the western boundary of the city of Norwich, which is a place called Harford Bridge, the mayor received the queen with a long Latin speech, which he recited in a manner that did great credit to the erudition of mayors in general. The purpose of it was, however, to offer a fair standing cup of silver, with a cover, containing £100 in gold. Lifting the cover, the mayor said to her majesty, "Here is £100 pure gold." One of the queen's footmen advanced to take it, when the queen said to him significantly, thinking he might not have understood the learned mayor's Latin, "Look to it, there is £100." When the royal procession had advanced within a flight shot of the metropolis of the east of England, and in a spot commanding a good view of the castle of Blanchflower, which stands like a mural crown above the city of Norwich, a pageant arrested the attention of the queen, representing King Gurgunt, to whom tradition imputes the building of the castle and the founding of Cambridge University. King Gurgunt having explained in verse his ancient doings in Norwich, another pageant beset her by the way at St. Stephen's Gate, from whence, says the annals of the city, an enormous muck-hill had been recently removed for the occasion. We will pass over the allegories which severally bestowed their tediousness on the queen, to arrive at the only pageant of real interest, some remnants of which are displayed at Norwich elections, and other grand occasions to this day. This was called the Stranger's Pageant, being the show of Queen Philippa's industrious Flemish colony, even in that era of Elisabeth, a separate and peculiar people in Norwich. There was a stage, with 7 looms actively at work with their separate weavers. Over the first was written the weaving of worsted, over the second the weaving of Russells, a sort of Norwich crape; among others the weaving of lace and of fringe, and several other manufactures, which it would be vain to seek as Norwich produce at present. Upon the stage stood at one end 8 small women children, spinning worsted yarn, at the other end as many knitting a worsted hose, and in the midst a pretty boy stood forth, and stayed her majesty's progress with an address in verse, declaring, that in this small show the city's wealth was seen. From comb wool we draw this slender thread, showing the spinners. From thence the looms have dealing with the same, showing the weaving in progress. And thence again in order do proceed these several works, with skilful art doth frame, and all to drive Dame Need into her cave. Our heads and hands together laboured have. We bought before the things that now we sell. These slender imps their work doth pass the waves, showing the women children, spinners and knitters. God's peace in thine we hold, and prosper well. Of every mouth, the hands, the charges saves. Thus through thy help and aid of power divine, doth Norwich live, whose hearts and goods are thine. Elisabeth had the good sense to be particularly pleased with this small pageant. She desired to examine the knitting and yarn of the small women children. She perused the looms attentively, and returned great thanks for this show. A grand pageant thwarted the entrance of the market-place from St. Stephen's Street. Here the queen was addressed by 7 female worthies, among which were Deborah, Judith, Esther, the city of Norwich, and Queen Martia. The last dame described herself thus: I am that Martia bright, who sometime ruled this land, as queen, for 33 years space, gat license at the hand of that Gargantius king, my husband's father dear, who built this town and castle both, to make our homage here. Which homage, mighty queen, accept, the realm and right are thine, the crown, the sceptre, and the sword, to thee we do resign. Thus Elisabeth was welcomed at various stations in Norwich, till she reached the cathedral, where she attended Te Deum, and finally arrived at the bishop's palace, where she sojourned during her stay at Norwich. On the Monday morning, a very excellent boy, representing Mercury, was driven at full speed through the city in a fantastic car, painted with birds and clouds, the horses being dressed out with wings, and Mercury himself appeared in an azure satin jerkin and a mantle of gold cloth. He was driven into the preaching green, on the north side of the bishop's palace, where the queen, looking out of her bedchamber window, beheld him jump off his car and approach the window in such a sort, that her majesty was seen to smile at the boldness of the boy. He looked at the queen with courage and audacity, then bowed down his head, shaked his rod, and commenced an unmercifully long string of verses. But the gist of his message was, that if her highness pleased to take the air that day, there were shows and devices to be seen abroad. Unfortunately it rained hard, and the queen did not venture out, but received a deputation from the Dutch church, with a goblet of exquisitely wrought silver, worth £50, presented with a speech, which pathetically alluded to the cruel persecutions perpetrated by Philip II and Alva in the Netherlands. Norwich was then crowded with Protestant emigrants, whom this conduct, impolitic as it was wicked, had expatriated, with their ingenious crafts and capital, from the Spanish dominions. The next day, her majesty was engaged to hunt in Sir Henry Jerringham's park at Cotsey. As she passed out of St. Benet's gates, Master Mercury and all the heathen deities were stationed there with speeches and presents of small value. Among others, Jupiter gave her a riding rod made of whale's fin. Venus presented her with a white dove. The little creature was so tame that, when cast off, it made directly to the queen, and sat before her all the time as quietly as if it listened to the speeches. The queen, and the French ambassadors who were in her train, dined on Wednesday with the young Earl of Surrey, heir of her victim the beheaded Duke of Norfolk. His residence was not at the famous Duke's Palace in Norwich, now utterly destroyed, but at a conventual structure by the waterside, at present in good preservation, not very large, but suitable to the altered fortunes of the young heir of Howard. The poet Churchyard, an old retainer of that family, was the person who had arranged all the pageants on this occasion, and when her majesty took her barge at my lord Surrey's back door, he had prepared a goodly mask of water nymphs, but the place being small and the passages narrow, he removed his nymphs to a spot lower down the river, where a deep hole had been dug in the earth by the waterside and covered with green canvas, which suddenly opening, as if the ground gaped, first one nymph was devised to pop up and make the queen a speech, and then another, and a very complete concert was to sound secretly and strangely out of the earth. Unfortunately, at the very moment when the queen passed in her coach, a thunder shower came down like a water spout, and almost drowned the water nymphs, while awful bursts of thunder silenced the underground concert. Though some of us got to a boat, and stood up under a bridge, probably Bishop's Bridge, we were all so splashed and washed, that it was found greater pastime to see us all look like drowned rats, than to behold the best of our shows. As the water nymphs were only great boys, who may be considered in the eastern counties almost as aquatic animals, our discomfited poet affords no commiseration for their sousing. But on the subject of their dresses, and on the impolicy of planning masques in England, exposed to the caprices of the climate, he is positively pathetic. What shall I say of the loss of the city in velvets, silks, and cloth of gold? Well, nothing but the old adage, man doth purpose, but God dispose. He contrived, however, a successful masque of Fairy, as the queen left Norwich on the Friday, when she passed to Sir Roger Woodhouse's mansion at Kimberley. Elisabeth bade an affectionate farewell to Norwich. She knighted the mayor, and told him she should never forget his city. When on her journey she looked back, and with the water in her eyes, shaked her riding whip and said, "Farewell, Norwich." The visits of Elisabeth to private individuals during her progresses were often attended with great expense and inconvenience, and occasionally with evil results to her hosts. In her homeward route from her eastern progress this year, an incident occurred little to the credit of the sovereign and her advisers, though it is related with base exultation by Richard Topcliffe in a letter to the Earl of Shrewsbury. Her majesty was pleased to pay one of her self-invited visits to Euston House in Suffolk, belonging to a young gentleman of the ancient house of Rookwood, who had just come of age. Here she abode with her suite a whole fortnight, and though much abuse is levelled at the youthful owner of Euston Hall, it seems his religion was his only crime. "This Rookwood," says Topcliffe, "is a papist newly crept out of his wardship. Her majesty was lodged at his house at Euston, fitter for the Black Guard. Nevertheless, this gentleman was brought into her majesty's presence by some device, and her excellent majesty gave Rookwood ordinary, or usual, thanks for his bad house, and her fair hand to kiss, after which it was braved at. Whether the thanks or the hand, it is difficult to divine. But my lord chamberlain, nobly and gravely, understood that Rookwood was excommunicated for papistry, called him before him, and demanded of him how he durst attempt her royal presence, he, unfit to accompany any Christian person, and adding, that he was fitter for a pair of stocks, forthwith commanded him out of the court, and yet to attend her council's pleasure." This was a strange return for a fortnight's hospitality, for if the queen and her courtiers had not liked their entertainment, why did they stay so long? But alas for poor Rookwood! His guests were not contented with this curious specimen of their courtly manners. Their next proceeding was to raise an outcry that some of their property had been stolen, and to ransack his house and premises. Unfortunate man! He was in much the greatest danger of being robbed, as the sequel will show, but no words, excepting those of Master Topcliffe, can do justice to this precious trait of the times. And to decipher the gentleman to the full, a piece of plate being missing in the house and searched for, in his hay house was found such an image of Our Lady as for greatness, for gayness, and workmanship, did never see a match, and after a sort of country dance, ended in her Majesty's sight, the idol was set in sight of the people, who avoided. Her Majesty commanded it to the fire, which in her sight, by the country folks, was quickly done to her content, and the unspeakable joy of every one, but some one or two who had sucked the idol's poisoned milk. But the guests of the owner of Euston Hall had not yet made Rookwood sufficient returns for his hospitality, for the amiable inditer of the epistle says, "The next good news, but in account of the highest, her Majesty hath served God with great zeal and comfortable examples, for by her counsel two notorious papists, young Rookwood, the master of Euston Hall, where her Majesty did lie on Sunday, now a fortnight, and one Downes, a gentleman, were both committed, the one to the town prison at Norwich, and the other to the county prison there, for obstinate papistry, and 7 more gentlemen of worship were committed to several houses in Norwich as prisoners." Such were our forefathers' ideas of serving God with great zeal and comfort. The strangest part of this letter is, that a man could write down a narrative of such conduct, without perceiving the hideousness of the polemic spirit that inspired his exultation in the incarceration of an unoffending young man among felons in a common jail, for no greater crime than quiet adherence to the faith in which he had been educated. Such were the neglected state of prison regulations too, at that period, that only in the preceding year, when the prisoners were brought into court for trial at Oxford, the noxious atmosphere that clave to them slew the Lord Chief Justice Bell, the principal law officers present, and most of the jury, as with a sudden blight. Such are among the records of the golden days of good Queen Bess, although the Privy Council appears more chargeable with this instance of persecution than the sovereign. Yet as the deed was transacted under her very eye, she cannot be acquitted of having sanctioned the cruel return that was made to her unfortunate young host for her entertainment at Euston Hall, so it is true that "they who permit oppression share the crime." Another instance is recorded of the ill consequences that resulted from one of Elizabeth's unwelcome visits, by Smith, in his Lives of the Berkeleys, who states, that she came in progress to Berkeley Castle, what time Henry Lord Berkeley, the then possessor, had a stately game of red deer in the park adjoining, called the Worthy, whereof Henry Lygon was keeper, during which time of her being there, such slaughter was made, as 27 stags were slain in the toils in one day, and many others on that and the next stolen and havocked. Whereof when this lord, being then at Calloden, was advertised, having much set his delight in this game, he suddenly and passionately disparked that ground, but in a few months after, he had secret friendly advertisement from the court, that the queen was informed how the same was disparked by him, on repining at her coming to his house, for indeed it was not in her justice, and at the good sports she had had in the park, advising this lord to carry a wary watch over his words and actions, lest that earl, meaning Leicester, that had, contrary to her set justice, drawn her to his castle, and purposely caused this slaughter of his deer, might have a further plot against his head and that castle, whereto he had taken no small liking, and affirmed to have good title to the same. The reader will scarcely wonder that, in many instances, considerable alarm was experienced by some of her loyal lieges at the idea of the expensive compliment of a royal visit. The Earl of Bedford writes thus to Lord Burleigh on the subject: "I trust your lordship will have in remembrance to provide and help that her majesty's tarrying be not above 2 nights and a day, for so long time do I prepare. I pray God the rooms and lodgings there may be to her majesty's contentation for the time." It is not generally known that, expensive as these visits were to private individuals, the cost of them to the public treasury was matter of deep concern. Even Leicester, in a letter to his enemy Sussex, on this subject says: "We all do what we can to persuade her majesty from any progress at all, only to keep at Windsor, or thereabouts. But it misliketh her not to have change of air." It was one of her peculiarities, too, that she gave very brief notice of the direction in which she meant to bend her course. Consequently, the nobility and gentry of the provinces must always have been in a state of excitement and expectation as to the royal movements, when her majesty gave indications of an intention of quitting the metropolis. Lord Buckhurst, who had reason to expect a visit from her majesty at Lewes in 1577, was so forestalled with respect to provisions by other nobles in Sussex that he was obliged to send for a supply from Flanders. Section 31.